Hey everybody, welcome to another episode of Earthly Headlines. Hey, I'm going to talk about evidence that came out, resetting the dates of the earliest evidence of Homo sapiens that has ever inhabited Europe. And now they're pushing the date back 150,000 years. I talked about a few of these episodes already of the oldest Homo sapiens in certain regions. One I did, the oldest Homo sapiens found in Africa, period, was in Morocco. It's about 315,000 years old. And then there was one in Israel that's about 177,000 years old. But the one in Europe was really interesting because it had long been speculated that there were Homo sapiens in Europe 200,000 plus years ago. But the smoking gun evidence that we had only dated to about 60,000 years ago or so of the oldest Homo sapiens in Europe. But now they found this skull. Actually, they found the skull in the 70s, but they didn't really reach any conclusions until recently as to whether or not it was a Neanderthal. Because for the past 40 years, they thought that skull was a Neanderthal, mainly because it was found close to another skull fragment that was for sure a Neanderthal. So let's take a look at this. And this skull is called Apidima 1, and the skull Apidima 2 was the aforementioned Neanderthal skull I was talking about. And so this is a view on the left from behind, and then the one in the center is the above view, and then the one on the right is what it looks like underneath from below. And again, this is very, very interesting because they're saying it's about 210,000 years old or so. And what I want to talk about in this video is not just the finds and how they dated it, but also how it breaks open this open discussion about what exactly was going on between Homo sapiens and Neanderthals, and what areas were they occupying, because we know for sure that these Homo sapiens, who by the way they didn't leave any descendants, which I'll get into later, but this offshoot group of Homo sapiens, were they an offshoot group? Like, what was the extent of their advance into Europe, and how is it that Homo sapiens were there first and then Neanderthals came afterward? So we'll discuss that in this video. So the first thing is they go to this place in Greece. It's called Apidima Cave, which is in southern Greece. So let me pull up the map here. So in southern Greece, they find there are these caves here, and what they find is these fossilized bones, which is lodged in this sediment layer called breccia, which is a type of sediment that forms from a mosaic or a mixture of a bunch of other sediments as well, and over time it calcifies and becomes this thing called breccia. So that's what they found these bones in. If true, then this is indeed the oldest member of our species ever found outside Africa. It was remains of a member of an early wave of humans who spread into Eurasia. I want to talk about this because Yuval Harari has a book called Sapiens that I recommend you all read, and he doesn't believe, but he talks about this theory that there is evidence that humans were trying to leave Africa well before 70,000 years ago. And it was around 200,000 years ago, and this group, from what he describes, it was a failed attempt to leave. So they tried to leave, but it wasn't really successful, and they tried again, and then they were successful. So this kind of sheds more light on what exactly happened, and maybe he was wrong when he was talking about how it wasn't successful. Maybe it was successful, but we just haven't found all the remnants yet. So anyways, it's a huge mystery. Based on genetic studies in the fossil record, anthropologists think that these early pioneers failed to gain a successful foothold and ended up being replaced by Neanderthals. Yeah, that's what Harari was talking about as well. So in the 1970s, they find this partial skull lodged in a chunk of breccia, a few centimeters away from a broken and distorted Neanderthal skull called Apidima 2, which was about 170,000 years old. So it was very interesting that they find these two really ancient skulls relatively close to each other. And because of that, forever they thought Apidima 1 was a Neanderthal. But a couple of paleoanthropologists Katerina Harvati and Eberhard Karls from the University of Tübingen, they reclassified it as a Homo sapiens because the skull was rounded in the back, which is a feature unique to Homo sapiens. It could, like, we have to go by the classification with the rounded skull at the back because that is true. In the fossil record, that is Homo sapiens is the only skull that has a rounded back, but it might be that might not be a safe assumption for certain people. Certain people might say, well, maybe it was just another undiscovered species of Homo that wasn't sapiens, but also had a rounded skull in the back. And it could be that too. Either way, it depends on how you look at it. But for the sake of this video, I'm just going to refer to it as Homo sapiens. So they did a uranium series dating, which indicated that the skull could be 210,000 years old. I'll get more into that date later. It's a few thousand years older than Mislia 1, which is in a previous video that I did, which is the oldest human outside Africa between 177 to 194,000 years ago, which was found in Israel. So it's lost. If this is true, if 210,000 years old is 100% verified, then yes, the Mislia 1 skull will no longer be the oldest human outside Africa. But either way you slice it, this 210,000-year-old Greek skull is the oldest in Europe, bar none, by 150,000 plus years. Fits pretty well with the growing pile of evidence that the earliest humans spread farther and faster than anthropologists have previously given them credit for. And again, that's because we haven't found as much evidence. Every day we find something new. So naturally, you'll find something older and older if indeed people did go, and by people I mean Homo sapiens, if Homo sapiens did go into Europe way earlier than we thought, it makes sense that the dates keep getting pushed back because we're finding more evidence. Southeastern Europe was probably an important route from the Levant into Europe and parts of Asia. So let's look at the map again. So Israel's over here in your bottom right. So if indeed Homo sapiens were here 177,000 years ago at the very least, then their route into Europe is pretty obvious. It's through Turkey, right? But again, this is 200,000 years ago or so. So if they were in southern Greece, what the logical question to ask is, what were the sea levels like? And there are no one knows for sure what the sea levels were like, but there are photos and artistic images speculating what the Mediterranean would have been like at the last glacial maximum. And the last glacial maximum looks something like this. The Mediterranean, there was Italy and Sicily were a lot closer to northern Africa than it is now. You can see again here the Mediterranean is kind of divided in half. And then here's a better photo zoomed into Greece. So again, if the coastlines were anything like this 200,000 years ago, then you can see the distance is not as great as it is now, which is, it looks like this. And here's another picture of Europe at the last glacial maximum as well. And you can see that Doggerland's here and everything's connected to the mainland in Europe. So, so it's not so unimaginable that some of these populations would have expanded their range to reach Southeast Europe. And again, the geography bears that out here. So it's not a crazy idea. Even the Strait of Gibraltar as well might have been an avenue. And then again, we talk about the idea of dead reckoning and intervisibility, and perhaps you could see Europe from Africa in some places. Harvati and her colleagues CT scanned the bone so they digitally reconstructed the broken bone first, all the pieces of the skull, and then they ran it through a statistical analysis of how its dimensions and shape compared to other fossil skulls. So they cross-examined them with other fossils from humans, Neanderthals, and other hominins. And so consistently, the analysis suggested that Apidima 1 was a Homo sapiens. So again, this is all statistical analysis. It doesn't take into effect that there might have been a Homo sapiens that wasn't Homo sapiens, right? It might have been a human that wasn't Homo sapiens, rather. But again, we don't know. We can only go by what we know, what's in the record, and it's parallel with what a Homo sapiens skull would have been. By looking at the ratios of uranium isotopes in a rock or fossil, geochemists can date when it was formed. In this case, Harvadi and her colleagues came up with several potential dates, some of which are much earlier than 210,000 years ago. So here's the contention here. Another geochemist says that these earlier dates are probably a product of uranium from the breccia itself, where the partial skull ended up being after wash through the cave. So some geochemists think that this uranium from the breccia deposit just leaked into the fossil bone over time, which could be an explanation as well. And so again, we expect this to be reanalyzed, redated, and argued about for a long time. Apidima 1 is the oldest Homo sapiens fossil in Europe by a margin of 150,000 years, and that's a significant claim. So because it's a significant claim, it's going to go through all kinds of criticism, and hopefully that date stays. But if the date doesn't stay, if they downgrade the date for whatever reason, then one of the reasons will be likely what this geochemist Rainier Grun from Griffith University says, that the uranium from the breccia somehow leaked or leached into the skull itself. So again, it's a fantastic coincidence that you'll have two skulls together in all of Greece. You have one more skull, that's it in that time frame. So to have two together, that's a wonder of nature. The human and Neanderthal probably died around 40,000 years apart in different places in the labyrinthine Apidima Cave. At some point, water flowing through the cave washed both skulls down into the same chamber. That's what they think happened, because when they look at the uranium isotope ratios of Apidima 1, it's different from the surrounding rock they found it in. So that suggests that the two skulls started out in different places and then formed at different times. The fossils formed at different times, and then later on they fell together through the water. And in addition to that, the Neanderthal signature was more similar to the surrounding breccia. So Apidima 1 more than likely found its way to Apidima 2 through this water. So again, here's the pictures. Here's the breccia here. Here's the cranium. And then these are the parts of the caves that it was found in. And again, it's very interesting that these network of caves parallels that of Israel, because Israel, I've mentioned many times that there are a ton of caves there as well. And I wonder if the ancients knew about these caves too. They probably did. Genetic studies of Neanderthal DNA have suggested that those living in Europe sometime after 270,000 years ago met early waves of human migrants. So that's very interesting, because in their DNA, they have traces of human alleles, human meaning Homo sapien alleles, in Neanderthal genomes around 270,000 years ago. So that must have meant that around that time, this offshoot group of Homo sapiens made it to, they ventured out of Africa or Israel and made it to Europe. So this might be that failed group that Harari was talking about. Harvadi says that Apidima 1 may be part of that long-lost group of humans who mingled with Neanderthals and then apparently disappeared. And the reasons why they disappeared, who knows? But genetic evidence suggests that non-African populations today all descend from the wave of humans who dispersed into the rest of the world between 70,000 and 50,000 years ago. This is that second attempt at the migration out of Africa that I mentioned earlier. And so again, part of this, around 70,000 years ago, seems to be a key point in human history, because that's also when Mount Toba exploded and destroyed most of humans as well. So who knows? Maybe this offshoot of humans were still alive and they just got wiped out by Mount Toba. We don't know for sure. Something must have happened. But either way, non-African populations descend from this surviving wave 70,000 years ago. So what happened to the older waves? Well, here are some of the theories. older waves of dispersal, humans who left tools and bones at sites like Mislia and other caves in Israel seem to have faded away without leaving descendants behind. That's kind of hard to believe. They probably had descendants, but they probably died off somehow. Several of those sites in Israel, the fossil record contains Homo sapiens remains in earlier layers. That's very interesting as well, followed by Neanderthals in later ones, which suggests that Neanderthals temporarily replaced humans living in the area, and then something likely happened to the first wave of humans in Europe too. So again, it's really weird that we find older. And again, remember how I said the digger you deep, the older things are. There's strata, the sedimentary dating. Well, Neanderthals they are found in later or more shallow sediment layers than the first Homo sapiens. That's very interesting. So there must be something to this group of Homo sapiens. Whether they got some eureka moment that other Homo sapiens didn't get, or they must have got wind or some sort of technology, whatever it was, they had the wherewithal and they succeeded in getting to Europe, at the very least southern Greece. This is a quote from Harvadi, I would suspect that these were relatively small populations that made it all the way to Greece. For example, probably smaller than the source population in Israel and ultimately from Africa. The first Homo sapiens may have arrived in the Levant and Europe to find Neanderthals already living there, and they coexisted for a while before somehow dying out. I would refer you back to my other video that Neanderthals did indeed live in Israel long term, in the Israel area long term. They weren't just passing through. So, or the alternative to this, that these Homo sapiens arrived in the Levant and coexisted with Neanderthals. On the other hand, perhaps the humans moved into unoccupied territory at the time, and then later on they got edged out or absorbed by a group of Neanderthals that migrated into the same region. So one of those two things might have happened. Paleoanthropologists don't know exactly what transpired between the two species or why, just as they don't know exactly why the Neanderthals went extinct around 40,000 years ago. They need more evidence, of course. Some of the questions that they'll be asked now, these leading questions into the next phase of this investigation, are what caused this early dispersal? What enabled it in terms of land bridges or particular routes of dispersal? I mentioned that earlier with the lower sea levels here, either through Turkey or maybe they just crossed the Aegean somehow, or they went through the Strait of Gibraltar, or they crossed this part, they went into Sicily, because look how close Sicily is to Africa. I mean, they could have easily made it to Sicily and then from Sicily into Italy and into Europe. But then they would have, in order to prove that, they must find some sort of skull dating to that time, 200,000 plus years ago. Were there any technological advances that enabled such a far geographic intrusion into Europe? Why did they die out? So these are all questions that they're going to investigate. So one of their plans now is to try to find ancient DNA and proteins in the skulls from Apidima Cave. Although she's not optimistic because the fossils are really old and the site is in a really warm region, and DNA it's not easily preserved in warmer climates. So again, let me know what you guys think about this. This is really interesting stuff. This is a breaking find, if true. If it really is 210,000 years ago, then again, we've got to investigate what was that group? Why is there genetic marker in Neanderthals? Their alleles are in Neanderthals, but how come they're not in any surviving humans now? Were they in a genetic cul-de-sac? Were they just a high, if you want to get really out there, were they ascended masters? Were they gods among men, right? Did they have some sort of divine missive where they were incarnated as humans like us, but they saw things way beyond that we see now, things that may be inexplicable to us? Who knows? Again, this is really interesting, and it really, it doesn't demystify our history, but it doesn't make our history seem so bleak and boring either. There was a lot going on back then, stuff that we might not even be able to fathom without any smoking gun evidence. So anyway, I'm sure I'll have more on this stay tuned, stay posted on this. You guys can do some reading on this as well. And send me some comments, share this, and I'll talk to you guys later.